Welcome back to the Male Vacancy Project podcast. I'm your host, Amadeus. Today, I want to talk about what male vacancy actually is, because I know that a lot of you probably have never even heard of this phrase until my show. So let's break it down. Male vacancy is a phrase that has developed and grown among the men's workspace and men's work community. Men's work being kind of the work of helping specifically men grow and heal past their traumas and whatever else. And it exists as kind of adjacent and parallel to traditional therapy models. All right. So in this episode, I'm going to discuss what male vacancy is. All right. I'll talk about a few of my theories as to why it's happening, and I'll offer some potential solutions. And my hope is that I'll give you some insight and reasons to pay attention and engage in this conversation surrounding the state of young men and boys, and follow my work as I move to help young men and boys find their way in becoming more healthy and mature and productive members of our society. So there are two definitions of male vacancy. The first definition is the general lack of participation by men, specifically young men, in our society. Now, there are multiple data points to back this up. So first off, over 60% of young men are single, and only just over 30% of young women are single, and young men and young women kind of classified as mid to late 20s and younger. All right. So there's a couple of reasons for this. One is definitely, according to studies and surveys, women in this age group tend to date older because, according to a lot of them through these surveys, women in this age group are looking for more emotionally and financially stable men to partner with. And men in their 30s and older tend to be more emotionally and financially stable. But another part of this is, which I'll get into a little bit more in a minute, is men in this age group just don't feel wanted. They don't feel desired. And so a lot of them are just kind of checking out and not engaging in the dating market. The next point is roughly 19% of men between the ages of 25 and 34 are still living at home, compared to only 11% of women in the same age bracket. Part of this has to do with the fact that the job market is so difficult, and that a lot of people in this age group, both men and women, are struggling to find jobs and find positions where they're able to make enough money to be able to afford to live on their own and afford to move out of the house. But the discrepancy between men and women suggests that a lot of men are not engaging in that way in society, which this next point points to. So about 10.5% of men between the ages of 25 and 54, which is what the government considers to be prime working age, are not employed, nor are they looking for work. And this compares to only 2.5% of the same age group from the 1950s. So over a roughly 70-year period, we have seen an 8% increase, 8 percentage point increase of men between the ages of 25 and 54 not employed and not looking for work. Next, only 57% of male high school graduates are attending university, compared to 67% of female high school graduates. And this statistic is very similar to the college completion rate. All right, so the gender gap among college completion is now wider than it was in 1972, but in the opposite direction. And the reason 1972 is an important date to refer this to is that's when Title IX was passed, which introduced the law that it is illegal to discriminate in college and university based on sex or gender. All right. So in 1972, when Title IX was passed, there was a 13 percentage point gap in favor of men getting college degrees. Today, just over 50 years later, there is a 15 percentage point gap in favor of women getting college degrees. So this points to both the rise in women getting college degrees, which is objectively an incredibly good thing, But it also points to the fact that less men are going to college and less men are completing college, which is not such a positive thing. All right. And then lastly, 15% of men under the age of 30 say that they don't have a single close friend. Male loneliness has been something that's been talked about a lot in media and in the news in recent years. And this is a direct statistic indicating that. As far as I can see, the main reason for the reduction in societal participation is this general feeling of being left behind by society. They feel as though society doesn't support or care about them, and they feel largely unwanted and unneeded. All right. The general attitude is something along the lines of, I'm lonely. Workplaces, universities, women don't want me. I feel like society views me negatively just because I'm a man. And no one seems to care about my emotional battles, my mental struggles. So I'm just going to stay home. Now, this likely wouldn't be such a problem if it weren't for the second piece of this. All right, so the second definition of male vacancy is a general lack of elder men in our society. So we have an abundance of older men, but a severe lack of elders. The key difference here in this context is that older simply indicates age, whereas elder is more defined by wisdom, maturity, life experience, and the general ability to guide other people. All right, so someone could be 70 years old and never done the work, right? Never done any of the work to become self-aware or emotionally mature. And so you could have a 70-year-old man who is obviously older numerically, but is not an elder in the community because he's incapable of guiding other people because he's not reached that point of maturity yet. And at the same time, you could have a 25-year-old man who has had such life experience and put in the work to become self-aware and emotionally mature and is at a place with himself where he is at peace with himself and he's able to guide other people. And so you could have a 70-year-old man who's not an elder and a 25-year-old man who is an elder. So age has nothing to do with it. It's entirely about life experience and what they have to bring the community. The main reason that I see for this lack of elders is that the majority of men living in today's world are in what Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, would call their immature or shadow form of masculinity, likely due to having either physically or emotionally absent fathers. And so they were never appropriately guided into this more mature form of masculinity as Jung describes it. And because of this, they are now incapable of guiding the next generation into this mature form of masculinity because they themselves still have not reached it. And the men who do exist in this mature form of masculinity are not in the lives of young men. In the last several decades, we have seen a systematic breaking down of male-only spaces. And these were spaces where traditionally these elder men were able to guide the younger men into this mature form of masculinity. Additionally, men are missing from certain crucial areas of our society. Less men than ever are in professions where they are in front of boys. These would be things like teaching, psych work, pediatric medicine, and the like. And there's a lot of statistics to back this up as well. All right, so the share of male teachers since the 1980s has gone from 33% to only 23% now. And fewer men are applying to teaching professions year over year. So this number is dropping. Only 24% of what the author of the book of Boys and Men calls heel jobs. So Richard Reeves defines heel jobs as health, education, administration, and literacy. All right, so only 24% of these fields are fulfilled by men, and that number is dropping. However, at the same time, we're seeing an increase in the number of heel jobs being created. So while we're seeing more and more heel jobs being created, we're seeing less and less men being in those heel jobs. Specifically, one field, the field of psychology, has dropped from 39% male to just 29% male in the last decade alone. And for psychologists who are under the age of 30, only 5% of psychologists under the age of 30 are male. So fast forward a generation or two, and psychology is now almost entirely a female profession. And we wonder why there's all these jokes, the common trope about men would rather do this than go to therapy, right? Well, most men would rather see a male therapist than a female therapist because a male therapist is going to better understand their life experiences. And if we're seeing less and less men going into the field of psychology, then less and less men are going to be interested in going to therapy. So this is a really important issue. Now, this general lack of engagement in these professions has kind of a dual effect. The first of which is that there are less men in those spaces and professions. And so it therefore becomes harder for young men and boys to follow their footsteps and go into those professions. They stop seeing those professions as spaces where men can exist. They start viewing those professions as those are jobs for women. That's the frame that they start to view it in because they don't see men in those professions. And so less and less men go into those professions. And so the problem escalates. And when you extrapolate this out over multiple generations, you eventually reach a place where men are not in those professions at all. And we're seeing this happen in real time as the statistics that I just quoted show. Another big piece of this is parental separation and the fatherlessness that we're seeing develop. Parent separation heavily favors the mother. 1 in 3 children don't see their father at all after a few years post-separation of their parents. And 4 in 10 children are born out of marriage, even more among less educated parents. Now, the problem with this is that men aren't needed in the home, not like they used to be, not from a financial standpoint. They are not physically, financially needed in the home because of the increase in economic independence that women have experienced over the last 50 years, which, again, to be clear, is objectively an incredibly positive thing. 40% of American households now have the woman as the main breadwinner. This progress towards gender equality is excellent. However, while we have redefined the role of women in our society, we have not redefined the role of men. Men are still expected to be the breadwinner. That's the societal narrative. And this is largely their only perceived purpose in the home. This is the problem. We need to get away from this obsolete model of the breadwinner father and re-examine the role the father plays in the household if we want to see our boys excel. Because the unfortunate fact remains, this fatherlessness negatively affects boys far more than it does girls. And it becomes intergenerational. As one father struggles and is absent, the boy suffers more than the girl does. And so the boy grows up to struggle in areas of education and the labor market. And because of this, will likely repeat what his father did and be an absent father himself, which then affects his son. And the cycle continues. The other effect of all of this is that if a child's father isn't present, and there are no other male family members like uncles or grandfathers around, the boys, by and large, don't have a single male role model that they can look up to. Especially when we consider all the statistics that I quoted earlier about men in professional roles. Really, the only place nowadays where boys can have a male role model, if the father is not present, is on a sports team with a male coach. But not all boys are able to engage in recreational sports. So the boys go looking for male role models online because that's what's available to them. But the majority of what they're finding online are these hyper masculine men who are existing in, as I said earlier, they're immature or shadow forms of masculinity. And they preach things like, in order to be a quote unquote real man, you need to display your strength by pushing others down. That's how you show your strength, by dominating other people, by dominating weaker men, calling them beta, by dominating the women in your life, being abusive, being misogynistic, and by showing your prowess by displaying financial success or displaying physical success. This is very much in contrast to the more mature form of masculinity, which shows strength as being more of service. To a mature masculine man, how strong you are is more defined by how much you can lift others up rather than push them down. And so these young boys who don't have fathers, who don't have male role models in their lives, go looking for what it means to be a man. And this is what they find. They don't find the mature masculine. They find these immature shadow forms of masculine. And so they grow up thinking that in order to be a real man, you need to be abusive towards women. You need to be misogynistic. You need to be disrespectful and dominant over anyone who's weaker than you. And so a vicious cycle is created where young men see this immature male role models, they follow them, and then they're called toxic masculinity, which makes them even more angry and feel cast out by society, which makes them go even deeper down this rabbit hole of what's called red-pilled cultures or the manosphere, and it just widens this divide. I believe that the solution is to have a resurgence of mature, elder, masculine men to guide young men and boys into becoming more productive and healthy members of our society. But to achieve this, we need men to heal from the wounds of past generations. And we're seeing a lot of millennials and Gen Zers doing this, putting in the work to heal from the wounds of their fathers, of their grandfathers, of their great grandfathers. And it's incredible to see. This is what we call the work. And aiding men and boys in this process will be the pursuit of this next chapter in my life. And it's why I wrote a chapter in a book about this. And it's why I started this podcast. And quick note on that. So I wrote a chapter in a book. The book is called Sacred Spaces, Volume 3, Subtle Shifts for Mind, Body, and Home Transformation. This right here is Volume 1. I've read Volume 1. It's incredible. I've read Volume 2. It's also incredible. And I had the privilege of writing a chapter in Volume 3, which is getting released February 18th, 2020. And what I wrote about was all of this. I and 24 other authors wrote about a life experience, what we learned, and some things that we can offer, some pieces of wisdom, a practice that we can offer to help other people learn and grow and heal from their traumas. And this is what I wrote about. I wrote about male vacancy. I wrote about this problem that we are having of young men and boys and of masculinity. And I wrote about all of it through the lens of getting out of an abusive relationship that left me completely just shattered, where I didn't know who I was. I suffered what I later learned to call an ego death. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I wanted in life. I didn't know who I wanted to be. I didn't know what kind of man I wanted to be. And so I went searching, as a lot of young men do. And the problem that I found was exactly what I said. Most of what I found was this immature form of masculinity, and I didn't identify with it at all. I I looked at the field and I saw on one side a group of people saying you need to be more like women in order to be a healthy presence as a man. And on the other side, it was you should just act like this. You should be misogynistic. You should be dominating. You should be disrespectful. And I hated both options. So I looked for something in the middle. And what I found was the work of Carl Jung. And what I found was a lot of other men operating in this space. And this is what I pursued. And I healed a lot. And I got to a place where now I am able to write about it in a book and offer my wisdom. And I'm also able to offer my wisdom through the podcast. So this is the purpose of this work. This is the purpose of this podcast. All right. So if you are a man, a young man or an older man who is struggling with life, struggling with trauma, struggling with feeling alone in the world, struggling with not feeling heard, struggling with feeling like you're unwanted, you're unneeded by society, struggling with what the hell does it mean to be a man in this modern world? This podcast is for you. I'm going to bring on a lot of people who are from my life, who I respect, a lot of men who I respect as men, who I think have good things to say on this topic of mature masculinity in the modern world. I'm also going to talk to a lot of women. I'm going to talk to a lot of members of the LGBTQ plus community about their perspectives on masculinity and their experiences with masculinity. My goal is to bring on as many different perspectives of manhood and of masculinity as possible so that we can kind of piece together something that works in this modern world. All right, so if you're a man who's struggling with this, hit that subscribe button. If you are the parent of a man who you see struggling, the parent of a young man who you see struggling and you don't know how to help them, this podcast is for you and for your son. If you're the partner of a man who you see struggling, this podcast is for you and for your partner. Share it with them. Share this with anyone who you think might benefit. Share this with anyone who might be interested in the conversation. And together we can redefine and uncover what masculinity means in this modern world, and we can change the world for the better. I really believe that. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Please hit that subscribe button, and I'll put a link to the book in the show notes. It's not out yet, but I'll put a link for the Be in the Know group so you can sign up to get an email when this book gets released. I'll put that link in the show notes so you can follow that and be in the know. And until next time, thank you. Amadeus signing off.